Today's story is Mark Antony. This is Antony, big, handsome, full-blooded fellow he was, with warm color under his olive skin and a strong, hard, muscular body that made him look like the statues of Hercules. He had the same short, curly hair, thick neck, and bold expression. He had, too, a flamboyant, colorful way of doing spectacular deeds on the spur of the moment. One might easily imagine him starting out to capture the man-eating horses, fight the bull, bring back the golden apples of Hesperides, or attempt any one of those other 12 fabulous labors of the old mythical Greek hero and half-god. Antony was proud of his likeness to Hercules. Appearing in public, he often dressed the part, wearing a short tunic, low-belted about his hips, a coarse cloak flung over his shoulders, and a broad sword at his side. Thus he would go striding along the forum, feeling no doubt as if the very blood of Hercules was pumping through his heart, and he believed it did, a few drops of it. According to family tradition, Antony's immediate ancestors were descended from Anton, who was a son of Hercules. And since Hercules was the son of Almighty Zeus, that gave a divine ancestor to Mark Antony. It put him almost in the class with Julius Caesar, if not quite equal to that most delightful goddess-like woman, Cleopatra, to whom, by the way, he wished he could have been given even more help than he had because she left Rome to return to Egypt. Antony's wife was a shrewd Fulva by name, a driving, scheming, ambitious woman who was annoyed at her husband most of the time for acting so like a big, overgrown, carefree boy. Though his friends had laughed and cheered and applauded, it hadn't amused his wife one bit to see him go leaping about the forum on the day of the Lupercalia, stark naked, except for a loincloth of goat skin. She could never forget it, neither could anyone else who had seen it. This was far the most fabulous Lupercalia in all the hundreds of years that the festival to the old wolf god had been celebrated. It was the day on which Antony, prancing up to the rostrum and holding aloft a crown, had offered it to Julius Caesar, either in jest or in earnest, and Caesar, sensing the temper of the crowd, had refused it. That was just a month to the day before Caesar died, so it was February, the month which took its name from the fibra, or throngs of skin used in the celebration. The old idea had been that if women were flicked by the fibra, they would be sure to have children. That was what Antony had been doing, striking right and left with his flying whip as he went leaping through the crowd, a cross of blood on his forehead with the dog and a goat slain in the open sacrifice. He was master of ceremony, heading the crowds of leaping naked boys. Also, he was the chief priest of the newly formed order of priests devoted to the new god Julius Caesar. For Julius Caesar, that day in his gold chair on the rostrum, had been recently raised by a decree of the Senate to the status of a god or national saint. A month later, Caesar was dead. There on the same rostrum where he had so lately been holding up a crown, Mark Antony was holding up a blood-stained toga, launching into a funeral oration. He had moved the crowd to such tears and fury that they had set fire to their hero's pyre and burned it there upon the forum. 2 months later, Antony seemed to have slipped in and to be comfortably established in the dead man's place, when suddenly, on a May morning, fate jogged his elbow, or, to be more exact, fate, in the strange disguise of a pale young man with a cold in the nose, was waiting in his vestibule. Mark Antony, consul of Rome and successor to Caesar, kept the pale-faced young heir to Caesar's fortune waiting as a long time before he saw fit to talk to him. First, Octavian had waited in the small courtyard or vestibule leading to the house. Then he had waited in the atrium. Octavian had turned in at a vestibule shortly after sunrise, when the day's business always began at Rome. He had waited there until Antony's clients, hanging about as usual, had either given up in disguise or hastened off, one by one, to present themselves to some other wealthy patron who did not sleep so late. Finally, passing the ever-present janitor guarding the front door with his dog, Octavian was admitted to the Erdium. Seated himself on a bench in the large reception hall, he waited another hour or two. Amused himself by counting the tiles on the floor, he studied the pattern painted on the ceiling and watched the clouds float by the opening in the center of it, and even bet with himself which was the final drops from last night's rain would drip first into the pool below. Meanwhile, he went over carefully, word by word, exactly what he planned to say to Mark Antony. At last he heard voices behind the curtains of the tabulum. Antony's familiar deep tone and a flattery one which he recognized as that of a man who formerly had been Caesar's secretary, and also the voice of the child. When the curtains were finally parted to admit him, he found Antony alone, seated carelessly, his legs wide apart, one arm flung over the low back of the chair. He was looking out through the large doorway into the pestrium. Out there, a nurse could be seen crossing the open, flowery courtyard with a small boy in her arms who waved to his father as they disappeared into the surrounding rooms. Antony then turned toward Octavian, who, with his eye for order and detail, had already noted among the jumble of papers on the table between them 2 elaborate inkwells, both carelessly left open for the ink to dry, and a water clock which seemed to be running. In reply to Antony's first question, Octavian stated simply that he had come to see about the money left to him by Caesar, as he wished to carry out the terms of Caesar's will. Antony laughed out loud. Was he crazy? How could a boy of his age expect to act as an executor? He himself, an experienced man, had had a tough time in the face of Caesar's enemy to do as much as he had. Just what had he done so far? Asked Octavia calmly. To be exact, what had he done with the private funds which he'd received on March 16th from Caesar's wife, Calpurnian? What? Antony scowled incredulously. Was this young upstart asking him for an accounting? Seemed he was, for now he was inquiring about the 700,000 sesterces which had been stored in the temple of Oops. What had become of that? For answer, Antony blew up in rage and exploded in a torrent of words. The result was that less than 10 minutes' worth of water could have dripped through the water clock before the stormy interview was over. A grim young man was marching across the atrium, past the doorman, through the vestibule, and out onto the street again, growling with every step, more grim, more set, and more determined to carry out the purpose for which he'd come to Rome, that of fulfilling the terms of his great-uncle's will and avenging his death. Also, he was planning deliberately, step by step, exactly how it might be done. Meanwhile, Antony, cooling off, laughing at himself for taking the youngster seriously, yet there was a cold look in his eye and firm tone in his voice. He tried to turn himself aside peaceably, if possible, but if not, if the young upstart didn't stop his meddling, by Hercules, he'd block the boy at every step.